The Ashbourne estate had never known silence like this. 16 of the world's most elite physicians moved through the private nursery like a swarm of white-coated panic. Their credentials hung on the walls of universities most people only dream of attending. Combined, they'd published over 200 peer-reviewed papers. They'd saved presidents, cured the incurable, and stood on stages accepting awards that came with million-dollar checks. Right now, none of that mattered. The machines screamed first. High-pitched, relentless alarms that sliced through the air like accusations. Oxygen monitors flashed red. Ventilators clicked and hissed, struggling to keep up with lungs too small, too weak, too confused to do what they were meant to do. A cardiologist from Mass General shouted orders at a pulmonologist flown in from London on a private jet. A pediatric toxicologist pushed past a neonatologist who'd been knighted by the Queen. Someone knocked over a tray of instruments. No one bothered to pick it up. And in the center of it all, surrounded by chaos she couldn't control and expertise she couldn't command, stood Vivian Hale. Billionaire, businesswoman, builder of empires. Frozen. Her navy suit was perfect, tailored to precision, pressed without a single wrinkle. Her hair, normally swept back in the kind of confident style that said I own the room, had begun to fall loose around her face. Her hands were raised, palms out, fingers spread wide in a gesture that looked like surrender or disbelief or both. Her mouth hung open, caught between a scream and a prayer she didn't know how to speak. On the silk sheets of a bassinet that cost more than most people's cars, her newborn daughter was dying. The baby's skin had turned a dusky, mottled blue. Not the bright, alarming blue of a bruise, but something worse, something subtle and creeping, like twilight settling in her tiny body and refusing to leave. Her lips, once pink and perfect, were now the color of shadows. Her breathing had gone shallow, each rise and fall of her chest weaker than the last, like she was forgetting how. We've tried everything, someone finally said. A woman in a white coat with gray streaks in her hair and exhaustion in her voice. She didn't say it loudly. She didn't need to. The words fell into the room like stones. For the first time in Vivian Hale's life, money had failed her. She'd built a fortune from nothing. She'd negotiated with ruthless competitors, outmaneuvered corporate sharks, and turned a single failing tech startup into a $40 billion empire. She bought homes in 7 countries, jets that flew faster than commercial airlines, and influence that opened doors most people didn't even know existed. She'd paid for the best prenatal care in the world. She'd flown in specialists for consultations before her daughter was even born. She'd had the nursery designed by architects, the air filtration system installed by engineers who worked for NASA, the medical equipment sourced from the same suppliers who outfitted operating rooms at Johns Hopkins. And now, surrounded by all that money, all that power, all that preparation, she was watching her daughter slip away. The doctors had run every test. Blood panels, imaging, toxicology screens, genetic markers. They checked for infections, allergies, congenital defects, environmental toxins. They debated and theorized and second-guessed each other with the kind of academic arrogance that comes from never being wrong. But nothing explained it. Nothing fit. And time was running out. Through the kitchen entrance, barely visible through the chaos, a young woman stood watching. She wore a denim jacket with frayed edges and patches sewn over the holes. The kind of jacket that had been worn too many seasons and loved too much to throw away. Her dark braided hair was pulled back from her face, and her eyes, steady, calm, impossibly focused, were locked on something no one else had noticed. A potted plant, sitting on the windowsill in the corner of the nursery, wrapped with a cheerful yellow ribbon, delivered 3 days ago as a congratulations gift from someone whose name no one could quite remember. It had glossy leaves and delicate white flowers that looked innocent. Beautiful even, but the young woman knew better. Her grandmother had taught her to read plants before she could read books. To see danger in beauty. To recognize the quiet killers that grew in gardens and greenhouses, the ones that didn't announce themselves with thorns or warning colors. Oleander, angel's trumpet, devil's kiss. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from certainty. She thought about what would happen if she was wrong. She'd lose the job her mother desperately needed. They'd be thrown off the estate. They'd have nowhere to go. Then she thought about what would happen if she was right and said nothing. She pulled her jacket tight, took one breath, and moved. What would you risk to speak up when no one's listening? Drop a comment below, because this story is just beginning. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Nyla Brooks had been standing by the kitchen counter for 11 minutes. No one had looked at her once. She was 14 years old, small for her age, drowning in an oversized denim jacket that had belonged to her older cousin before it belonged to her mother before it finally landed in Nyla's hands. The cuffs were frayed. The collar was worn soft from too many washes in cold water because hot water cost extra at the laundromat. There was a patch on the left elbow, sewn on with uneven stitches because Nyla had done it herself while her mother worked the night shift. She stood perfectly still, shoulders slightly hunched, hands tucked in her pockets, chin down just enough to look non-threatening. It was a posture she'd learned before she understood what she was learning. A survival instinct that lived in her bones. Be small. Be quiet. Be invisible. Her mother, Carmen Brooks, had worked for the Ashbourne estate for 9 years. She cleaned floors that never seemed to get dirty. She polished fixtures that gleamed even before she touched them. She wiped down countertops in kitchens she'd never cook in, straightened pillows on beds she'd never sleep in, and moved through the estate like a ghost whose only job was to make sure the living never had to think about the work it took to keep their world pristine. Carmen had raised Nyla in the margins of wealth, in staff break rooms and service hallways, in corners where children weren't supposed to be, but were tolerated as long as they stayed quiet. Nyla had done her homework on the floors of walk-in closets while her mother inventoried designer clothes. She'd learned her multiplication tables and pantries stocked with imported foods she'd never tasted. She'd grown up watching people who had everything from spaces where she had nothing. And she'd learned to notice things. Right now, while 16 doctors stared at screens and monitors and charts, debating lab results and vitals and medications, Nyla was watching the baby. The doctors saw numbers. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, respiration count. They saw data points that didn't add up, symptoms that didn't fit their diagnoses, test results that contradicted their theories. They argued about bradycardia and cyanosis and differential diagnoses, using words that sounded important because they were designed to sound important. But Nyla saw something else. She saw the way the baby gasped. Not coughed. Gasped. There was a difference. A cough came from the chest, forceful and expulsive. A gasp came from desperation, from lungs that couldn't find enough air and a throat that was searching, pleading, struggling. The baby's mouth opened wide, too wide, like she was trying to swallow the entire room. Her tiny chest heaved inward instead of outward, ribs pulling tight against skin that had turned the color of bruised fruit. Nyla's eyes narrowed. She heard the wheeze. The doctors heard it too, but they cataloged it differently. They called it respiratory distress and adjusted ventilator settings. They ran algorithms and cross-referenced pulmonary conditions. Nyla heard something else. It was wet, not the dry, tight wheeze of asthma or the high-pitched whistle of a blocked airway. This was different, thick, heavy, like the baby was breathing through water that shouldn't be there, like something was coating the inside of her lungs, drowning her from the inside out. And then Nyla noticed the third thing. Every time the baby was laid flat, on her back on the examination table, in the bassinet, she got worse. Her breathing became more labored. Her color deepened from dusky blue to something darker. The monitors screamed louder. The doctors moved faster. But when someone picked her up, even just for a moment, even just to reposition her, the baby improved. Not much. Not enough. But noticeably, her breathing eased. Her color lightened. The alarms quieted. The doctors didn't see it because they weren't looking for it. They were looking at machines. At numbers. At the sophisticated medical equipment they'd spent decades learning to trust. Nyla was looking at the baby. Something inside her began to scream. Not loudly. Not with words. But with the kind of knowing that lives deeper than logic. The kind her grandmother used to talk about before she died. You got instincts, baby girl, her grandmother would say, her weathered hands sorting through herbs she'd grown in chip pots on a fire escape. Most folks bury them under education and ego. But you got the gift of paying attention. Nyla's grandmother had been a healer. Not the kind with a degree or a license, but the kind the neighborhood came to when clinics were too expensive and hospitals asked too many questions about insurance. She taught Nyla about plants and tinctures, about reading bodies instead of textbooks, about seeing what was actually happening instead of what you expected to see. And right now, Nyla's instincts were screaming that everyone in this room was looking in the wrong direction. Her hands trembled inside her pockets. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced toward the doorway where her mother had been standing 20 minutes ago, the woman who'd warned her 1,000 times. Keep your head down. Don't make trouble. We need this job, Nyla. We need it. She looked back at the baby, at the way her little fingers curled and uncurled, at the way her chest fought for every breath. Nyla pulled her hands from her pockets, straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin. For the first time in her life, she decided to be seen. What would you do if you knew something no one else did? But speaking up could cost you everything. Drop your thoughts below and subscribe because what happens next will change everything. Nyla's eyes caught on something small, something decorative, something no one else was looking at because it didn't beep, didn't flash red, didn't demand attention with the urgency of failing machinery. On the antique dresser beside the crib, nestled between a silver-framed photograph and a crystal music box, sat an essential oil diffuser. It was elegant, modern, wrapped in pale wood grain with soft LED lights glowing beneath frosted glass. A delicate plume of vapor rose from its top, curling into the air like silk, carrying the scent of lavender and eucalyptus through the nursery. Calming, therapeutic, expensive, deadly. Nyla's breath caught in her throat. She remembered her grandmother's hands, gnarled and strong, gripping her shoulders on a winter afternoon 3 years ago. They'd been walking past a boutique in the city, one of those pristine stores with white walls and minimalist shelving where everything cost more than Nyla's monthly groceries. In the window, a display of essential oil diffusers had been arranged like art. Her grandmother had stopped walking, stopped so abruptly that Nyla almost stumbled. "You see that?" her grandmother had said, her voice low and sharp. Nyla had nodded, confused. "That right there kills babies." Nyla had laughed. She thought her grandmother was exaggerating the way old people sometimes did, turning minor concerns into catastrophes. But her grandmother hadn't been joking. She'd pulled Nyla away from the window and sat her down on a bench, right there on the sidewalk, and explained it with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for warnings about strangers in traffic. "Baby lungs aren't like ours," she'd said. "They're tiny, pink, still forming. They can't filter what we can filter. You put oil vapor in the air, doesn't matter how natural it is, doesn't matter how expensive. Those particles coat the inside of their airways, stick to the tissue. The baby breathes it in hour after hour, day after day, and the lungs start to inflame, start to fill with fluid. Looks like pneumonia. Looks like respiratory distress. Looks like 100 other things doctors will test for." Her grandmother had leaned in close, her dark eyes intense. "But it's not. It's slow suffocation. And the baby never chokes, never coughs it out, just gets weaker and bluer until the body gives up trying." Nyla had never forgotten that conversation. And now, staring at the diffuser with its pretty lights and its aromatic vapor, she felt her grandmother's warning slam into her chest like a fist. The baby had been fine until 3 days ago. The diffuser had been installed 3 days ago. The pattern fit, the wet wheeze, the worsening when laid flat, when her face was closer to the vapor-heavy air that settled low. The gasping, the dusky color, the lungs that couldn't process oxygen no matter how much the ventilators pumped in. Nyla's hands clenched into fists. She turned toward the nearest doctor, a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses who was adjusting a foreline. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, nearly swallowed by the noise of the machines and the chaos of medical commands being shouted across the room. "Excuse me." He didn't turn. She stepped closer. "Excuse me, I think." "Not now," he said without looking at her. His tone wasn't cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was dismissive, automatic. The voice of someone who'd spent decades being interrupted by people who didn't matter and had learned to tune them out without conscious thought. Nyla's jaw tightened. She moved toward a younger doctor, a woman in green scrubs who was documenting vitals on a tablet. "The diffuser," Nyla said louder now, pointing. "That thing by the crib. I think it's—" "Sweetie, we've checked environmental causes," the woman said, barely glancing up. Her voice was kind, but patronizing, the way adults talk to children who think they've solved the problem adults have already considered. "The air quality is pristine. The estate has medical-grade filtration. It's not environmental, but we need this space clear," a nurse interrupted, stepping between them. She wasn't unkind, but her body language was firm. A boundary, a wall, family and essential personnel only. "If you're not staff, I need you to wait outside." "I'm staff," Nyla said, her voice cracking. "My mom." "Then you know better than to be in here during a crisis." Across the room, a security guard in a black suit had turned to face Nyla. His expression was neutral, but his attention was fixed, watching, assessing. His hand rested casually near the radio clipped to his belt, the universal signal of someone ready to act if necessary. Nyla felt her face flush hot. Her heart pounded. Every instinct told her to back away, to shrink back into invisibility, to protect herself and her mother and the fragile security of their place on this estate. But the baby's heart rate monitor suddenly flatlined into a sustained, screaming alarm. "She's crashing," someone shouted. The room exploded into motion. Doctors swarmed the bassinet. Someone called for epinephrine. Someone else started chest compressions with 2 fingers on a sternum smaller than a bottle cap. Vivian Hale let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a sob, a guttural noise that came from somewhere deeper than words. And Nyla stood frozen, watching the diffuser continue its gentle, poisonous work, vapor curling into the air while everyone looked everywhere else. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. "They'll never see it. People trust what's pretty, what's expensive, what's marketed as safe." Nyla took a breath. Then she moved. Sometimes the truth is right in front of us, but only if we're brave enough to see it. What would you do in Nyla's place? Comment below and hit subscribe. This story isn't over yet. The head physician's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Prepare for intubation." The words hung in the air for half a second before the room shifted into coordinated crisis mode. A nurse wheeled over a crash cart. Another tore open sterile packaging. Someone dimmed the overhead lights to better see the baby's airway. Metal instruments clinked against metal trays with sounds that felt too sharp, too final. Intubation, the last resort. A tube forced down a throat barely wider than a drinking straw, past vocal cords that hadn't yet learned to form words, into lungs already drowning in inflammation and fluid. Nyla's stomach dropped. If she was right, if the essential oil vapor had been coating the baby's airways for 3 days, inflaming tissue, building up residue that blocked oxygen exchange, then forcing a tube down would do nothing. Worse than nothing. It would push the contaminated mucus deeper. Seal it in. Turn the baby's lungs into a closed system with nowhere for the poison to go. It would kill her. Nyla's eyes darted across the room, moving too fast, taking in too much, her brain racing through possibilities with the kind of desperate clarity that only comes when everything is falling apart. She saw the doctors, 16 of them, huddled around the bassinet, their backs forming a wall of white coats and certainty. They spoke in abbreviations and medical codes, a language designed to exclude anyone who hadn't spent a decade learning it. They were brilliant, educated, credentialed, and they were about to make a mistake they'd never see coming because they'd already decided what was and wasn't possible. She saw Vivian Hale. The billionaire mother was no longer standing. She collapsed into a chair someone had brought, her perfect navy suit wrinkled now, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs she was trying to suppress because even in crisis, even in devastation, she'd been trained her whole life not to lose control in front of people. But she was losing it now, piece by piece, breath by breath. She saw the security guard, still watching her, his expression unreadable but his posture alert. Ready. And then Nyla saw the sink. It sat in the corner of the nursery, installed for sterilization and hand-washing, gleaming chrome with a high-arch faucet. Water. Gravity. Distance from the diffuser. Her grandmother's voice rose in her memory, not as a whisper, but as a shout, crystalline and urgent. If something is blocking breath, gravity must help. It had been a humid August night. Nyla had been 9 years old. Her grandmother had been treating a neighbor's baby who'd inhaled bathwater and couldn't stop wheezing. The mother had been panicking, ready to call an ambulance they couldn't afford. But Nyla's grandmother had stayed calm. She'd held the baby upright, chest against her shoulder, and patted the tiny back with firm, rhythmic pressure while tilting the infant slightly forward. Gravity and positioning. Simple, ancient, effective. You can't force breath, her grandmother had said afterward, but you can help the body remember how to do it. Get them upright. Get the blockage moving down and out, not deeper in. Let gravity do what machines can't. Nyla's hands were shaking so hard she had to clench them in a fist to make them stop. The doctors were arranging equipment. The anesthesiologist was preparing sedation. The baby's heart rate was barely detectable on the monitor, a weak, irregular beeping that sounded like a countdown. 30 seconds, maybe less. Nyla looked at the diffuser, still running, still poisoning the air with its pretty vapor. She looked at the baby, blue and gasping. She looked at the sink. She thought about everything she'd been taught her entire life. Stay invisible. Don't make trouble. Know your place. Her mother's face flashed through her mind. Tired, worried, holding on to this job with both hands because it was all they had. If Nyla was wrong, they'd lose everything. They'd be thrown out. Blacklisted. Her mother would never work in this city again. But if she was right, and she did nothing, the baby would die. Not because there was no solution, but because no one with power was listening to the girl without credentials, without authority, without the right last name or the right clothes or the right voice. Nyla's chest tightened. Her vision narrowed. The room seemed to tilt around her. She thought about all the times she'd been invisible, all the times she'd bitten her tongue, all the times she'd watched injustice and inequality and carelessness and said nothing because speaking up wasn't safe. This was different. This was life or death. And for once, just this once, Nyla had something none of the experts had. The right answer. Intubation kit ready, someone announced. On my count, the head physician said, leaning over the baby with a laryngoscope in one gloved hand. Nyla's body moved before her brain finished deciding. She didn't think about consequences, didn't calculate risk, didn't weigh her future against this moment. She just ran, past the nurses, past the crash cart, past the security guard who shouted something she didn't hear. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the marble floor. Her oversized jacket flapped behind her like broken wings. She ran toward the bassinet, toward the baby, toward the choice that would change everything. And every person in that room turned to stare. Sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything. What happens next will leave you speechless. Drop a comment with your prediction and smash that subscribe button. You won't want to miss this. Nyla's hands closed around the baby. She didn't ask permission, didn't announce her intention, didn't explain. There was no time for words, no space for justification. She just lifted the tiny body from the bassinet, so light, so terrifyingly fragile, and ran. What are you doing? The shout came from everywhere at once. From the head physician whose hands were still gloved and ready. From nurses frozen mid-motion. From someone near the door whose voice cracked with disbelief. Nyla didn't stop. Her sneakers pounded against marble. The baby hung limp in her arms, head lolling, skin the color of storm clouds. Monitors shrieked behind her, alarms screaming abandonment, wires yanked free and dangling. Stop her! The security guard moved. Fast. His hand went to his belt, not for his radio this time, but for something else. Something that made Nyla's peripheral vision blur with fear. His boots thundered across the floor. His voice boomed. Put the baby down. Now. Vivian Hale's scream cut through everything else. No, don't. Someone stop her. She's going to. The words dissolved into a wail, raw and animal, The sound of a mother watching her child being taken by a stranger in an oversized coat who had no right, no authority, no reason to be trusted. Nyla reached the sink. Her hand shook so violently she almost dropped the baby. She twisted the faucet with her elbow, couldn't spare a hand, couldn't risk losing her grip, and water exploded for the tap. Loud, shocking, cold. She positioned the baby face down over the basin, one hand supporting the tiny chest, the other cradling the head, and held her directly under the stream. Water hit the baby's face, poured over her nose and mouth, streamed down her chin and neck. The room erupted. Oh my God, she's drowning her. Someone get that girl. Footsteps converged from every direction. The security guard was 3 steps away, hand outstretched, face twisted in fury and fear. Doctors abandoned their equipment and rushed forward. A nurse screamed. Another grabbed for Nyla's jacket and caught only air. Vivian Hale collapsed to her knees, hands pressed against her mouth, eyes wide with horror, so complete it looked like madness. Nyla held the baby steady under the water, tilting her at an angle, firm pressure against the tiny back, letting gravity and the cold stream work together. She blocked out the shouts, blocked out the hands reaching for her, blocked out everything except her grandmother's voice. Upright. Forward. Let it come out. The security guard's hand closed around Nyla's shoulder. Then the baby coughed. It wasn't a small cough. It was deep, violent, a full-body convulsion that arched the baby's back and forced something up from her lungs with the kind of power that should have been impossible for someone so small. Thick, foamy fluid spilled from the baby's mouth into the sink. Not clear, not normal, but yellowish white and viscous, like mucus mixed with oil, coating the stainless steel basin in streaks that caught the light. It kept coming, cough after cough, the baby's tiny body heaving, expelling, purging what didn't belong. The room froze. Every hand reaching for Nyla stopped mid-air. Every voice cut off mid-syllable. The security guard's grip on her shoulder went slack. And then, a cry. Sharp, piercing, furious. The baby screamed like she'd just discovered she had lungs and was outraged at how hard they'd been to use. It was the most beautiful sound Nyla had ever heard. Angry and alive and breathing. Nyla kept the baby positioned under the water for 3 more seconds, letting the stream rinse away the remaining residue from her face and airways. Then she turned off the faucet, wrapped the baby in her own jacket, the worn denim suddenly the softest thing in the world, and turned around. The baby was pink, not blue, not dusky, pink. Her chest rose and fell in steady, normal rhythm. Her fingers curled and uncurled. Her eyes squinted against the light. She cried with the healthy indignation of an infant who was cold and wet and confused, but very much alive. Nyla looked up at the monitors across the room. The heart rate had stabilized. Oxygen saturation climbing. 87%, 91%, 94%. Numbers that made sense again. Numbers that meant life. Absolute silence filled the nursery. 16 doctors stood motionless, their faces cycling through expressions too complex to name. Shock, confusion, disbelief, something that might have been shame or might have been awe. The security guard's hand fell away from Nyla's shoulder. He stepped back, his jaw working like he wanted to speak but had forgotten how. Vivian Hale rose slowly from her knees, her legs shaking, her perfectly styled hair falling loose around her face. She took 1 step toward Nyla, then another. Her eyes were locked on the baby. Her baby, screaming and squirming and beautifully, impossibly alive. She reached out with trembling hands. Nyla, without a word, placed the baby into her mother's arms. The billionaire held her daughter against her chest and sobbed. Great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. The kind of crying that can only come after terror has been replaced by relief, so profound it breaks you open. She's breathing, Vivian whispered. She's. Nyla nodded. Her own voice was gone, stolen by adrenaline and exhaustion and the weight of what had just happened. The head physician moved slowly to the sink. He looked down at the yellowish foam coating the basin, touched it with one gloved finger, brought it close to his face. His expression shifted. What? His voice cracked. What is this? Nyla's eyes moved to the diffuser on the dresser, still glowing softly, still running, still poisoning nothing now because the baby was safe. She found her voice. It came out quiet but steady. Essential oil residue. From the vapor. 3 days of breathing it in. Her lungs couldn't filter it. It was drowning her from the inside. Every eye in the room turned to the diffuser. Someone unplugged it. The truth was hiding in plain sight. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is act when everyone else is frozen. What would you have done? Comment below and subscribe, because this story is far from over. The security guard's grip returned, harder this time. Ma'am, I need you to come with me. Nyla's arm was wrenched behind her back. Not violently, but firmly, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Her shoulder screamed in protest. Her feet stumbled as she was pulled away from Vivian and the baby, away from the sink, toward the doorway where her mother now stood, face drained of color, hand pressed over her mouth. Wait, Nyla gasped. You violated protocol, the head physician said. His voice was tight, controlled, but something dangerous simmered underneath. You interfered with medical treatment. You put that child at risk. She saved her. Vivian's voice cracked through the room like lightning. She was still holding the baby, still crying, but her eyes had found Nyla. Don't you dare. Mrs. Hale, I understand you're emotional, but this girl had no authority. I don't care about authority. Vivian shouted. My daughter is breathing. But procedure was procedure. The machinery of institutional power had already started grinding forward. The security guard pulled Nyla toward the door. Another guard appeared, speaking into his radio about unauthorized personnel and security breach. Nyla's mother reached for her daughter with shaking hands, whispering apologies, begging her to stay quiet, to not make this worse. The head physician turned to a nurse. Get environmental services in here and run a full panel on that substance in the sink. I want to know exactly what. It's lipid aspiration, Nyla said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Despite the hands restraining her. Despite everything. Test for oil particulates in lung tissue. Check for inflammatory response to aerosolized essential oils. It's in the medical literature if you look. The doctor's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. Didn't acknowledge her. Just nodded to the nurse. They ran the tests. Nyla sat in a windowless office for 43 minutes while her mother paced and cried and whispered that they were going to be fired, that they'd lose everything, that Nyla should have stayed quiet, should have stayed invisible, should have known better. But Nyla couldn't regret it. Not when she could still hear the baby's cry echoing in her mind. Angry. Alive. The door finally opened. The head physician stood in the doorway. Behind him, 2 other doctors. Their faces were carefully neutral, but something had shifted. Something in their posture, in the way they wouldn't quite meet Nyla's eyes. The tests came back, the physician said slowly. Lipid-laden macrophages in the aspirate. Inflammatory markers consistent with chemical pneumonitis. Particulate matter matching the molecular composition of essential oils, specifically lavender and eucalyptus. Silence. The nursery has been sealed for 3 days, he continued, his voice growing quieter. The HVAC system was shut off to maintain temperature control. The diffuser was running continuously. The baby was... He paused, swallowed. The baby was breathing concentrated oil vapor with no ventilation for 72 hours. Nyla's mother let out a small sob of relief. The doctor looked at Nyla directly for the first time. You were right. The words hung in the air like an admission of guilt. The water displaced the residue, coating her airways, he continued. The positioning allowed gravity to assist expulsion. The cold temperature stimulated the cough reflex. It was... He stopped. Started again. It was the correct intervention. We would have intubated. Sealed the contamination deeper. We would have... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. They would have killed her. The door opened wider. Vivian Hale stepped through, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, pink-cheeked and breathing normally, a nasal cannula delivering supplemental oxygen as a precaution. She looked at the doctors, then at the security guards, then at Nyla, and she dropped to her knees. Right there, in her expensive suit, on the floor of a staff office, the billionaire businesswoman who'd built empires and commanded boardrooms knelt before a 14-year-old girl in a frayed jacket. "You saved my daughter," Vivian said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute certainty. Public, witnessed, undeniable, when no one else could, when no one else would listen. Tears streamed down her face. When I wouldn't listen, she reached out and took Nyla's hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being brave enough to act when I was too afraid to see." The head physician cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale, the girl still violated. She saved my daughter's life." Vivian didn't stand, didn't let go of Nyla's hand, didn't break eye contact. While 16 of the world's best doctors stood in that room, with every piece of equipment money could buy, a 14-year-old saw what you couldn't. She knew what you didn't, and she had the courage to act when all of you were ready to give up. The doctor's face flushed red. "We weren't giving up, we were. You were wrong." Vivian's voice wasn't cruel, just factual. "You were brilliant and educated and experienced and wrong. And you would have killed her trying to save her because you couldn't imagine that the answer might come from someone without credentials." She finally stood, still holding the baby, and turned to face all of them, the doctors, the security guards, the staff members who'd gathered in the hallway. "Authority isn't the same as truth," she said. "Expertise isn't the same as wisdom. And sometimes the people we overlook, the people we dismiss, the people we don't think are qualified to speak." She looked at Nyla. "Sometimes they're the only ones who can see clearly." The room was silent. The head physician shifted his weight, adjusted his glasses. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, human. "You're right," he said to Nyla. Not to Vivian, to Nyla. "I'm sorry we didn't listen." One by one, the other doctors nodded. Some looked ashamed. Some looked shaken. All of them looked at Nyla differently now, not as an obstacle to be removed, but as the person who'd seen what they'd all missed. The machinery of institutional power, so quick to restrain and dismiss, ground slowly to a halt. Authority collapsed in front of truth, and in its place, something else began to grow. Real courage isn't having all the answers. It's speaking up when no one wants to hear you. What's one time you wish you'd been brave enough to act? Share below and subscribe for the powerful conclusion. The investigation took 9 days. Corporate forensics traced the diffuser back to its source, a shell company registered in Delaware, funded by a board member of a rival tech firm. The gift hadn't been a gift at all. It had been a weapon, disguised in frosted glass and elegant wood grain, wrapped with a cheerful ribbon and a congratulations card signed with a name no one could verify. Not an accident, an assassination attempt. On a newborn. The arrests came swiftly. Federal agents. Conspiracy charges. Attempted murder. The rival executive's face appeared on every news channel, led away in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions he refused to answer. But that wasn't the story people remembered. The story people remembered was the girl. Teen saves billionaire's baby while doctors watch. The housekeeper's daughter who saw what medicine missed. Invisible no more. How one 14-year-old's courage exposed a deadly blind spot. Nyla's face appeared on screens across the country. News anchors told her story with reverent voices. Medical journals published retrospectives on lipid aspiration in infants. Pediatric safety protocols were rewritten. Essential oil companies faced lawsuits. Parenting forums erupted with debates about diffusers and aromatherapy and the hidden dangers lurking in products marketed as natural and safe. The world paid attention, but Nyla barely noticed. She was too busy adjusting to a life that no longer required invisibility. 6 weeks after the incident, Vivian Hale held a press conference in a marble lobby of the Ashbourne estate. She stood behind a podium, her daughter, healthy now, thriving, sleeping peacefully in a nearby bassinet attended by nurses who'd been specifically trained in environmental pediatric safety. Today, Vivian announced, her voice steady but weighted with emotion, "I'm establishing the Brooks Institute for Pediatric Environmental Safety." The name landed like a revelation. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras flashed. Named after Mariah Brooks, Vivian continued, Nyla's grandmother. A healer who served her community for over 40 years. A woman who understood that knowledge doesn't only live in universities and medical journals. That wisdom can be passed down through generations, through experience, through paying attention to what others overlook. Her voice caught. She paused, composed herself. The Brooks Institute will research environmental hazards to infant health. It will train medical professionals to consider non-traditional knowledge systems. It will fund scholarships for students from underserved communities pursuing careers in pediatric medicine and public health. And it will ensure that what happened in my home, the near death of my daughter because experts couldn't see past their own assumptions, never happens to another family. The funding was substantial. $50 million to start. Located in the neighborhood where Nyla's grandmother had healed neighbors with herbs grown in chipped pots. Where she taught Nyla to notice, to see, to trust her instincts even when the world told her she was too young, too poor, too unimportant to know anything worth knowing. Carmen Brooks no longer cleaned floors. She worked as the Institute's community liaison, connecting medical researchers with the neighborhood healers and herbalists and grandmothers who'd been practicing medicine without credentials for generations. She wore professional clothes now, attended meetings, spoke at conferences. But the biggest change was in her posture, shoulders back, head high, the weight of invisibility finally lifted. Nyla received a full scholarship to a private academy. Not as charity, but as recognition. Vivian had been explicit about that. You didn't save my daughter because you got lucky, she'd said. You saved her because you were educated, just not in the way people like me usually recognize. This scholarship isn't a gift. It's an apology for how long it took us to see you. The academy was strange at first. Nyla walked through halls where other students carried designer bags and discussed vacation homes. But she also found teachers who listened when she spoke. Classmates who wanted to hear about her grandmother's herbal remedies. A science teacher who encouraged her to document traditional healing practices as part of a research project that later won regional awards. She was visible now, but she hadn't forgotten what it felt like to be overlooked. 7 months after the incident, Vivian invited Nyla to the estate for the baby's first birthday celebration. The nursery had been completely renovated. No diffusers. Medical grade air filtration. Environmental sensors monitoring air quality in real time. A plaque on the wall reading, "The smallest voices sometimes carry the most important truths." Nyla sat in a rocking chair, uncomfortable in the party dress Vivian had sent over, watching the birthday girl demolish a cupcake with a single-minded focus only a 1-year-old could manage. The baby looked up, locked eyes with Nyla, and reached out with one frosting-covered hand. Not toward her mother, not toward the nanny or the guests or the expensive toys scattered across the pristine carpet. Toward Nyla. Nyla took the tiny hand in hers, feeling the sticky warmth of frosting and trust. "She remembers you," Vivian said softly, standing in the doorway. "I know that sounds impossible, but I swear she does. She's calmer when you're here." Nyla smiled. Babies are good at noticing things. So are you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the baby play, surrounded by safety measures that existed now because a 14-year-old girl had refused to stay quiet. Nyla thought about her grandmother, about all the knowledge that lived in hands that had never held diplomas, about all the people who moved through the world unseen, unheard, dismissed as unqualified, about how close they'd all come to losing something precious because the people in power couldn't imagine that wisdom might come from unexpected places. The baby squealed and clapped her hands, delighted by nothing in particular, simply alive and healthy and celebrating a first birthday she almost never reached. Not because Nyla was rich, not because she was powerful, but because she had noticed when no one else did. And because, for once, she had been brave enough to act. The most powerful thing you can do is pay attention and speak up even when no one wants to listen. Your voice matters. Your perspective matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. If this story moved you, drop a comment about a time someone overlooked, dismissed your insights. And subscribe, because stories like this remind us why courage matters.